Celebrating the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life with Sterling Fox on AM 650.
And welcome back to the program. On Boomer Life today, we're talking about solutions to debt problems. If you're feeling like you're on an island of financial trouble, if you have excessive debt in your life and you don't have to feel isolated or overwhelmed, there is hope, there is freedom, there's always a solution. Brett Luckin is with us. He's Vice President of Abakhan and Associates. They are proposal administrators and trustees in bankruptcy. And Brett, you've talked about the difference between a consumer proposal, which allows an indebted person to pay his or her way out of that pickle, or bankruptcy, which is the other option, in which the indebted person pays nothing. So what are the consequences, one versus the other, in terms of you down the road and your credit potential?
I need to actually just put something on the table there as well. It's something that you said. In a bankruptcy, someone may potentially have to pay something.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so there is, in fact...
well, this is important to have.
Yeah,
okay.
There's a series of calculations which are used, and maybe we can get into that in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the differences between a bankruptcy and a proposal and how it shows on your credit rating,
okay.
The way that it works, if you're a first-time bankrupt, the period of your bankruptcy, which ordinarily is 9 months or 21 months, plus 6 years is how long it will show on your credit report.
Okay.
Okay. While in a consumer proposal, it's the period of the consumer proposal plus 3 years. So if your consumer proposal runs the maximum period, which most people's do, which is 5 years.
5 years, okay.
It's 5 plus 3 years, therefore 8.
Oh, so they're essentially the same.
They're essentially the same. Having said that, though, of course, in a consumer proposal, you've never gone bankrupt. So if in year 9 or year 10 you were asked the question and someone were to look at your at your credit report, they would not see the proposal and you would not be answering yes to the question, have you been bankrupt? Whereas obviously in a bankruptcy, the reality is in that particular circumstances that you would have to say yes, that I had been bankrupt.
I see.
And I should point out that a second time bankrupt, it sits on the credit report for 14 years after the date that you are discharged from bankruptcy. And as a second time bankrupt, you may be bankrupt for 2 to 3 years, potentially 17 years.
Right.
So it's quite punitive to make the mistake twice.
Well, it's interesting because people have kind of a cavalier attitude towards bankruptcy in some business circles. For example, you go out there to the Wild West in Alberta and Saskatchewan, where some of these small oil companies, they drill and sometimes something comes out and sometimes it doesn't. And if it doesn't, they go bankrupt. And by gosh, we'll try again next year.
Yes.
And it's just it's almost like a way of doing, if we blow it, we'll just go bankrupt and start again. It's really casual almost, and it's not supposed to be treated that way.
Well, what I should say is that it's bankruptcy, particularly at a personal level, doesn't have the same stigma associated with it that it used to, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago.
Oh, okay.
I'll never forget there was this older gentleman who phoned me who had been bankrupt when he was about 30 years old, and now 40 years had passed and he was in his 70s. And he was adamant he was not going to go bankrupt again because he had very clear recollection of how poorly him and his family were treated 40 years ago as a result of his bankruptcy at that point in time.
This is possibly one of the reasons, particularly, this is boomer life, particularly we boomers are perhaps a little more reluctant than our children to go to a bankruptcy trustee because back in the day, if you went bankrupt, it was a really negative social thing, wasn't it?
Unbelievably so. Whereas these days, really, I mean, not that in any way I want to play down.
Of course not.
Because again, there's what we were referring to earlier, the shame and the fear associated with the process. The fact of the matter is you do need to see it that in some circumstances, you're unable to repay your debt, and doing nothing is not a viable solution.
Right.
Doing nothing will result in garnishment of bank accounts, wages, judgments, potentially seizure of your assets, your house. These are things that you don't want to entertain. And sticking your head in the sand for 2 years, 3, 4 years until eventually the axe comes down from somewhere is completely the wrong way to deal with the issue.
And yet people do that,
and yet many people will do that, and they will come to our front door when already there are judgments on their homes, when their assets already been seized, their houses have been foreclosed on. And when you count backwards and you say, if just 6 months or a year ago you had come to see me, things could have been different.
Right. Well, people start feeling that way, though. So let's straighten it out. I'm going to ask you about the how this applies nationally and how different provinces deal with things. But just on that level of the bankruptcy and just the whole matter of well, the shame and the fact that it doesn't vary a whole lot from person to person. If you're in debt, you're in debt, and you've got to resolve it.
Yeah.
There's no getting around it.
In the Bankruptcy Insolvency Act is a federal act, so largely there is very little difference with how it's applied across the nation.
Right.
Having said that, though, when we figure out if in a bankruptcy there are certain assets which the bankruptcy trustee would have the right to seize, there are what are known as provincial exemptions. And so without going into too in-depth an explanation, the bottom line is that if you were to go bankrupt, all your assets vest in the trustee. So theoretically, your trustee has the right to seize those assets and make some kind of money out of them and sell them and then distribute that to your creditors.
To the creditors, right.
The truth is, though, that there's a whole bunch of exemptions which apply. An example is you're allowed to keep up to $4,000 worth of household furnishings.
Okay.
Practically speaking, very few people have realizable value in excess of $4,000 of household furniture. So the truth is that trustees and bankruptcies do not come and visit your house to count your knives and forks.
Right.
Okay, and it's a myth, and it's one of the things that concerns people terribly. Well, you're coming to my house, are you going to,
Well, and that's what I was going to ask you. When people come to the office sometime, and they say, and you've already told us, that sometimes they go, well, gosh, Mr. Luckett, I think I have to go bankrupt. And they've been stalling it, putting it off, because in their minds, when that happens, they're going to lose their car, they're going to lose their house, they're going to be shamed out of their job. The whole thing is just going to implode.
The whole house of cards is going to fall apart. And
that's not the case, is it?
No, it's not. And in fact, very often, if an example, the house, very many people, in fact, by and large, most people do not lose their homes. And if they do lose their homes, it's not because the trustee in bankruptcy takes it away from them, but because their cash flow means they can no longer support the mortgage payment.
Right.
And that, therefore, the bankruptcy really practically has nothing to do with the fact that their house is getting foreclosed on. Mm-hmm. They cannot afford to make the payments. And so bankrupt, not bankrupt, you were going to lose your house. Right. So the truth is that when you go bankrupt, you don't lose your house by and large most of the time, because the bankruptcy trustee will sit down and look at the value of the home. He'll look at what the costs of sale are. He'll look at things like what mortgages are against that property.
Sure.
And then there's still an exemption, which in Vancouver is $12,000 and in the rest of BC is $9,000, that you're allowed to keep out of the proceeds of your house. Now, when you put all those figures together, very often there is no equity. There's no money left over. And in that situation, your trustee in bankruptcy will go, you can make the mortgage payment, and the house stays yours, and I take no interest in that.
Right, okay.
And many people have the automatic assumption that just because they go bankrupt, that means they're going to have to be moving out in the next month or two.
And again, I think, to be fair, some of those assumptions or worries, Brett, are fed by the people who are hounding them. You told a story. We're having a coffee there just before we went on the air today, and you were telling us, because we were discussing some of the behaviors of some of these loan collectors, some of which is illegal and unethical. You told us a story about a client of yours who had gone to Asia and who had been harassed all the way to Asia and told by some guy in Canada that if you don't pay your debts, the next time you come home to Canada, we'll have you arrested at the airport.
Correct.
And that's just absolute nonsense.
It's complete nonsense. The nature
That's a lie.
There was no fraud or any kinds of criminal act involved. It was literally just ordinary, normal debt. And the credit counselor, or it's not credit counselor, I apologize.
The loan collector.
The credit collector or agency or whoever that was doing it had come to the conclusion, I don't know, that this was a clever way to get this guy to pay his debt because he was out of the country. And of course he's phoning me and saying to me, is this true? Is that what's going to happen?
Am I going to be arrested when I come home?
I have a wife and a child. I don't want to get arrested at the airport when I arrive. And I'm just, that's nonsense. There's no way they're going to do that.
But I suppose when you get to the point where you are being constantly harassed by these very aggressive debt collectors, who are pretty good at what they do and very sort of borderline in most of their behaviors, you tend to, because you're sort of beaten down and just torn up internally, it starts to sound true. They can say anything and you go, oh, gee, really? You know, and
Yes.
again, as if you can get any more worried, they manage to find a way.
Yeah, and they do, and they really do. They lay it on really thick. They will tell you all sorts of things. And there was an older lady the other day who was told they were going to take her house away.
Yeah.
And after 5 minutes with her, it was very clear there's no way on earth that we're ever going to do that to her. Just by looking at her situation, I could see that there was no way that was going to happen. But this is what she had been told, and she was older, she was single, she lived in a small trailer, and it was her only substantive possession.
Right.
So for her, that created an enormous amount of fear. And yeah, she was very, very stressed about a fear that was completely unfounded.
When someone comes to Abakhan and Associates, and you have offices all over the province, and in our immediate listening area, they're in Victoria, in Surrey, and in Vancouver. When they come into the office and they say, you know, I'm being threatened daily. These people are going to take away everything I own. When they come to you, and you begin the formal process of resolving their debts, Brett, whether it's through a consumer proposal or a bankruptcy, at what point does the wolf at the door get shut up?
Almost, practically speaking, actually almost immediately. Those calls will evaporate inside a week to 2 weeks once notice has been given to those creditors. The credit collection agencies will stop calling. They understand that there's now a formal process in place. The communication is then starts to happen directly with us, the trustees in bankruptcy, or the administrator of the proposal.
Right.
And people stop phoning the debtor or the bankrupt completely, and suddenly, you know, their phones stop ringing.
Right.
And so often we get people saying, oh, my life has just changed. It's just as a simple result of that.
Right. Simply, again, we talked about this earlier, but the fact that you've talked to people, and as recently as a few days ago, that woman who was literally so
Wringing
stressed she
her
was
hands.
wringing her hands during an entire half-hour conversation.
Yeah, for 45 minutes nonstop.
Just being eaten up by all of this. It
Yes.
just rots right away at your insides. It's
It
horrible.
It really does, and you can see it so often you see it. Yeah.
And I guess the point of all of this is the fact that there is hope. It is never as bad as those people who are trying to collect for whatever commission they're going to make on what you owe. It's never as awful or as horrible as those aggressive people would have you believe, and they can never do half of what they threaten you with.
Yes, and if I in 30 seconds were to summarize the role of the trustee in bankruptcy, is to understand that as officers of the court, it's our job to balance, on the one hand, that there is an individual who requires to get out from under their debt, restart their life, get rehabilitated, get a fresh start.
Right.
On the other hand, there are creditors who are owed money and are entitled to some sort of resolution on that debt.
Definitely.
At whatever level. And the trustee in bankruptcy sits between those two stakeholders and attempts to, on the one hand, get money for the creditors, while on the other hand, helping that debtor or bankrupt restart their life. We do not represent either of the two of them. Our job is to resolve that process, and it's federally regulated, so we do it as objectively and as is humanly possible.
Right.
Yeah.
Brett Luckin is vice president with Abakhan and Associates. He and they are trustees in bankruptcy and proposal administrators. This is Boomer Life. We do highly recommend you pay a visit to moneytroubles.ca. That's the website for Abakhan and Associates. Terrific resource. And even if you're taking some comfort from the conversation that Brett and I are having, you'll find a little bit more at moneytroubles.ca. And Brett and I will be back after this.
Canada's only weekly radio show dedicated to the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life on AM 650.